"Grandma, please give a coin to that boy," the grandson asked, pointing to the boy playing the violin near the expensive restaurant. But when the old woman looked closely at the beggar's face, her voice trembled. That night, when the Hernandez family died, all the violins in the city fell silent. Old musicians later said that strings broke on their own, and instruments groaned instead of playing melodies. The church organ fell silent in the middle of morning mass, as if mourning someone's death. Even the birds didn't sing for 3 days. But there are things in this world stronger than death. There is music that cannot die as long as at least one heart lives that is able to hear it. And 5 years later, as Consuelo Mendez was walking through the central square with her groceries, the music returned. It returned to turn the world upside down. Consuelo Mendez always woke up to the sound of a violin. At 73, she had kept the habits of her youth, rising at dawn, brewing strong coffee in a copper sieve, and stepping onto the terrace to water her flowers. But the highlight of her morning ritual was the music drifting from the neighboring blue house. That's where the Hernandez family lived: Miguel, a bus driver, his wife Isabella, a schoolteacher, and their 8-year-old son Mateo. An ordinary family, if not for one extraordinary fact: their boy was a genius. Consuelo noticed it when Mateo was just 2 years old. The toddler could listen to classical music on the radio for hours, swaying in rhythm and conducting with his tiny hands. At 3, he could reproduce any melody he had heard once. At 5, his parents bought him a used violin, and a miracle happened: the boy picked up the instrument as if he had been playing it all his life. This child was born with music in his heart, Consuelo would often say to her neighbor Isabella over the fence. His music teacher, Senor Rafael, was amazed by the boy's talent. "He is what we call duende, the soul of music," he explained to the parents. Children like this are born once in a generation. Every morning, Mateo practiced for an hour before school. The sound of the violin filled the quiet neighborhood, and the neighbors would come out to their terraces to listen. On Fridays, the boy held concerts in the yard under the big avocado tree, and the whole neighborhood gathered with woven chairs, forming an impromptu audience. Consuelo always sat in the front row. Her own daughter and grandson lived in the capital and couldn't visit often, so the Hernandez family became a source of joy for the elderly woman. Especially Mateo, who called her Abuelita Consuelo and would come running after school to tell her about his day. "When I grow up," he told her one day at sunset, "I'll play in the biggest concert halls in the world, and you'll definitely be in the front row." "Of course, my dear," Consuelo hugged him. His parents did everything they could to support their son's talent. Isabella cut back on her own needs to pay for lessons. Miguel took extra weekend jobs. Every spare coin went into a box labeled Mateo's future. They were saving for the conservatory in the capital. On Thursday of that final week, Isabella received a letter from the conservatory requesting a video recording of Mateo's performance for the preliminary scholarship selection. "We'll make the recording next week," she planned. But next week never came. On Friday morning, the family was preparing to visit a sick great-grandmother in a nearby town. The 85-year-old woman had broken her hip, and Isabella was worried. "We'll be back late tonight," Isabella told Consuelo over the fence as Miguel checked the car. "Mateo wants to play for his great-grandmother. He says music will help her heal." Mateo waved from the window of their old Volkswagen Beetle and shouted, "See you tomorrow, Abuelita. I'm almost done learning Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and I'll play it for you." Consuelo waved back, watching the blue car disappear around the corner. She didn't know it was the last time she would see the boy happy, the last time she would hear his voice full of dreams for the future. The next morning, the silence woke her before the alarm. For the first time in years, the sound of the violin didn't come from the neighboring house. On that Saturday morning, Consuelo woke up to a strange silence. Usually by 7, she would already hear the sound of the violin from the house next door. Mateo was very disciplined and never missed his morning practice. But today was quiet, and the absence of those familiar sounds alarmed the elderly woman. They must have come home late, she thought, brewing coffee in her copper sieve. Or maybe Mateo decided to take a day off. But deep down, she felt a growing unease. Around 11 o'clock, Consuelo stepped out onto the terrace to water her flowers and noticed that the windows of the Hernandez house were still closed. Normally, by this time, Isabella would already be hanging laundry in the yard and preparing breakfast. The strange silence was beginning to feel frightening. Around noon, 2 police cars and a fire truck pulled up to the Hernandez house. Consuelo looked out the window and saw several uniformed officers heading to the neighbor's front door. Among them was the local police chief. The old woman's heart clenched with the foreboding of something terrible. The officers knocked, then one of them wrote something in a notebook while another spoke on the radio. The grim expression on his face left little doubt, the news was bad. Then they noticed Consuelo watching from the window and started walking toward her house. Each step the officers took echoed in the old woman's chest like a heavy blow. She knew she was about to hear something terrible, something that would change her life forever. Consuelo didn't wait for them to knock. She hurried out into the garden. "Señora Mendez," one of the men asked, checking his notes. "Yes, that's me," Consuelo replied, and her voice sounded unfamiliar even to herself. "My name is Officer Ramirez. I'm very sorry, but I have to inform you of some sad news about your neighbors, the Hernandez family. We understand you were close to them." Consuelo's world froze. Time slowed down, and every word the officer spoke echoed in her mind. What happened to them?" she whispered, gripping the doorframe for support. "Last night, around 10 o'clock, they were returning home from a nearby town. The accident happened on the mountain road between San Miguel and our city. There was heavy rain, and visibility was poor. Preliminary reports suggest their car failed to make a turn and went over the edge into a ravine." Consuelo felt her knees weaken. "And what about them?" she asked again, though the answer was already written on the officer's face. "The car fell from a great height and exploded upon impact with the rocks. The explosion was massive, almost nothing was left of the vehicle. Unfortunately, no remains were recovered. We know the Hernandez family was in the car, but due to the nature of the incident, it's impossible to confirm the exact number of victims. That's why we knocked on their door. We hoped, maybe, someone stayed home. I'm very sorry, Señora." The words exploded and "no remains recovered" sounded in Consuelo's ears like a sentence. Miguel, Isabella, and Mateo. Little Mateo, with his magical violin and eyes full of light and music. The boy who just yesterday waved at her from the car window and promised to learn a new piece. They all left together, all 3 of them, Consuelo murmured helplessly, and then suddenly burst into tears. The officer stood silently, giving the old woman time. "We were told you were very close to the family. If you need psychological support or assistance," he began. "No," Consuelo interrupted. "Thank you. I need to be alone." When the officer left, Consuelo closed the door and leaned her back against it. The house around her felt empty and cold, though nothing had physically changed. The same walls, the same furniture, the same photographs on the dresser. But the world that had existed just an hour ago was gone forever. She walked into the living room and sat in her favorite armchair by the window, from where she had a clear view of the Hernandez house. The blue walls Miguel had painted last spring. Isabella's garden with roses and lavender. Mateo's window, from which violin music used to drift every morning. Now it was all just an empty shell. A house without life, a garden without its keeper, a window from which music would never flow again. The following days passed in a haze. Consuelo felt as if she were living in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Neighbors came to offer condolences, brought food, offered help, but she barely heard them. The whole world had lost its color and sound. The Hernandez house stood quiet and empty. No more violin in the mornings, no laughter from Mateo in the yard, no voice of Isabella calling her son to lunch, no rumble of the old car's engine when Miguel came home from work. Even the flowers in Isabella's garden began to wilt quickly without her care and love. The entire town came to the memorial service. Instead of coffins, 3 symbolic wreaths stood in the church, each with a photo of one of the departed. Consuelo couldn't believe she was looking at a portrait of little Matteo, knowing he was truly gone. Music teacher Raphael played Vivaldi's Four Seasons on the organ, the very piece Matteo had been practicing in his final week. The organ's solemn tones filled the church with mournful beauty, and many cried, remembering how beautifully the boy had played the same melody on his violin. Consuelo sat in the front row next to Isabella's relatives, who had come from the capital. Among them was the very grandmother they had been visiting that day. 85-year-old Elena sat in a wheelchair, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "They were coming from me," she whispered. "If it weren't for me, they'd still be alive." Consuelo took the old woman's hand in hers. "Don't blame yourself. No one could have known. God called them home." As she said it, she broke down in tears. She missed Matteo so much. After the service, a symbolic monument was erected in the cemetery, 3 white marble plaques bearing the names of the deceased, but with no graves beneath them. It was a monument to emptiness, a reminder that even the chance to say goodbye to their bodies had been denied. After the funeral, Isabella's relatives came to clear out the house. They were kind people, but they lived far away and couldn't manage another property. The house was to be sold, and the belongings were either taken or donated to those in need. Consuelo asked to keep Matteo's spare violin, and the relatives agreed without hesitation. "Take his sheet music too," said Isabella's aunt. "We saw how much he loved you. These things belong with you." Consuelo brought home the small violin in its worn case and a stack of sheet music filled with a child's handwriting. On some pages, Matteo had made notes in pencil, marking difficult sections or jotting down his thoughts on how to play certain musical phrases better. She placed the violin in her living room on a special shelf crafted by the neighborhood carpenter. But she could never bring herself to take it down or even open the case. It was too painful to think that Matteo would never play his violin again. Years passed, but the pain never truly faded. Consuelo learned to live with her grief, but she never learned to forget. Every morning, stepping onto the terrace with her coffee, she instinctively listened for the sound of a violin that no longer came. The silence that had once been rare had become her constant companion. The Hernandez house changed hands several times. First, it was bought by a young couple from the capital, but they stayed only 6 months. The woman said she didn't like the energy of the place. Then it sat empty for several months before being rented by a family with 2 teenagers who were too noisy for the quiet neighborhood. Now, a young childless couple, Ricardo and Patricia, lived there, keeping mostly to themselves. Consuelo missed the warm friendship she had shared with the Hernandez family. She remembered Sunday lunches under the avocado tree, the smell of coffee and fried tortillas drifting from the neighbors' windows, the sound of children's laughter in the yard. Now the house was neat and impersonal, as if no one truly lived there anymore. Matteo's violin still stood in Consuelo's living room, covered with a thin layer of dust. The dust gathered slowly but steadily, and from time to time the old woman would gently wipe it off with a soft cloth, trying not to look at the instrument for too long. Beside the violin lay a stack of sheet music, the very pieces Matteo had studied with his teacher, Raphael. Sometimes the old maestro would visit Consuelo for tea. "You know, Señora Consuelo," he would say, "children like Matteo don't just disappear without a trace. Their music remains in the world forever, even if we can no longer hear it. Somewhere in the universe, the melodies he played are still echoing." Consuelo wanted to believe those words, but reality was cruel. Matteo was gone, and with him, his music had vanished. And yet, strangely enough, the old teacher was right. When he spoke those words, somewhere far away, by a miracle and the will of a remarkable boy, Matteo's violin was indeed producing beautiful sounds, bringing joy to people he had never met. No one knew this, but on that fateful Friday when the Hernandez family died, a miracle occurred, and with it, a new tragedy. The accident happened exactly as the police had described. Heavy rain had turned the mountain road into a deadly trap. The old Volkswagen Beetle failed to make a sharp turn on the wet asphalt, crashed through the metal guardrail, and plunged into the ravine. Matteo had indeed been in the car at the time. He was sitting in the back seat, clutching the violin case to his chest, dozing to the rhythmic tapping of the windshield wipers. He had spent the whole day with his great-grandmother and was exhausted. He had played music for the old woman, helped his mother care for her, listened to family stories, and played in the yard. Seconds before the crash, Matteo was jolted awake by his mother's scream. Isabella had realized they were skidding and let out an instinctive cry. The boy opened his eyes just as the car broke through the guardrail. Time slowed. Matteo saw the world spinning, felt the car flipping in the air. Instinctively, he curled into a ball, covered his head with his arms, and held the violin case tightly against his chest. The car tumbled down the slope, crashing through trees and smashing against rocks. At one point, the rear window shattered, and Matteo, small and light, was thrown from the vehicle, still clutching the case. He landed in dense bushes, while the car continued its deadly descent, ending in a twisted heap of metal. Then came the explosion. Fortunately, Matteo had been flung far enough to avoid the blast. He lost consciousness from the impact and lay in the bushes all night, drenched by the pouring rain. His left arm was broken, his body bruised and scraped, but the worst injury was a head trauma that erased all memories of his past life. When rescue crews arrived in the morning and saw what was left of the car, they didn't find the boy. In the darkness and downpour, no one noticed the violin case lying in the bushes a bit further away from the wreck. No one thought to search for Matteo. Everyone assumed no one could have survived the explosion. But a few hours before the rescuers arrived, a stranger had found him. His name was Carlos Velasquez, a petty thief and con man who was scavenging near the ravine for valuables among the wreckage. Carlos was 35, living hand-to-mouth through odd jobs, thefts, and small-time scams. When he saw the child in the bushes, he first thought the boy was dead. But then he noticed the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Matteo was alive, but in deep shock. He didn't respond to voices, didn't answer questions, just stared blankly. Carlos realized the child had been in the crashed car. He also guessed that everyone would assume the boy had died, which meant no one would come looking for him. And in that moment, a cold, opportunistic plan began to take shape. Instead of taking the child to the hospital or calling the police, Carlos took him home. He also grabbed the violin but left the case, deciding it was too heavy to bother with. Carlos lived in the slums of a city a couple of hours' drive from the crash site. His home consisted of 2 rooms in a crumbling building that he rented from someone just as marginal as himself. Living with him was Luisa, a 40-year-old woman who earned a living cleaning offices and selling stolen goods. "Where did you find this kid? And why'd you drag him here?" Luisa asked when Carlos brought Matteo home. "On the street. He's a stray. Probably hit by a car," Carlos lied. "I picked him up. Might come in handy." Luisa wasn't a sentimental woman, but the sight of the injured child moved her, if only slightly. She cleaned Matteo up, made a makeshift splint for his broken arm, and treated his wounds. The boy didn't resist, but he also didn't respond, as if his soul were somewhere far away. For several days, Matteo lay on an old mattress in the corner of the room, barely moving or speaking. He ate what was brought to him, drank water, but seemed absent, like a ghost. "What's wrong with him?" Luisa asked. "He must have been through something bad," Carlos replied. "It'll pass." Carlos named the boy Pedro and told him that was now his name. Matteo didn't object, he didn't remember any other name. His mind was locked behind the wall of trauma and amnesia. The only thing that remained unchanged was his connection to music. A week after Carlos brought him home, Matteo saw the violin case in the corner of the room. Something stirred in his eyes, his first real reaction to the outside world since the accident. The boy walked over to the case, opened it, and took out the violin. The instrument felt natural in his hands, like an extension of his body. Matteo raised it to his chin, picked up the bow, and drew the first note. The melody came by itself, mournful, aching, filled with pain the boy could not express in words. He played for a long time, and Carlos and Luisa listened in stunned silence. They knew nothing about music, but they understood they were hearing something extraordinary. Where did a street kid learn to play like that? Luisa whispered. Carlos didn't answer, but a plan was already forming in his mind. A child who could play like that could make money. Good money. He's a gold mine, he said. Carlos quickly realized the child had a rare gift and decided to exploit it. A month after the crash, once Pedro's arm had healed, Carlos sent him out to play on the city streets. At first, Pedro was afraid. He didn't remember his past, but instinctively felt that begging for money wasn't what he was meant to do. He feared he might be arrested. But Carlos was persistent and, at times, aggressive. "You'll play, or I'll throw you out on the street," he threatened. Who needs a useless stray kid who can't earn his keep? Luisa was kinder, but didn't defend the boy. "Do what Carlos says," she told him. "We can't afford to feed you for free." His first day on the street was a nightmare. Pedro stood outside a shopping center, the violin case open in front of him, his hands trembling as he held the instrument. People walked past, some dropped coins, but most ignored the skinny boy with the frightened eyes. But then Pedro started to play, and everything changed. Music flowed from his bow with such power and beauty that passers-by stopped in their tracks, mesmerized. Within hours, the case was full of coins and bills, more money than Carlos usually earned in a week. "You're heaven sent," Carlos said that evening, counting the money. "Tomorrow, you'll go to a different spot." And so began Mateo Hernandez's new life, a life where he no longer knew his real name, no longer remembered his parents or the home where he had been loved. He was just Pedro now, a little street musician playing for spare change, his extraordinary gift used by those who saw only profit in his pain. Carlos and Luisa were not cruel in the literal sense, but they were selfish and cynical. They fed the boy, bought him cheap clothes, and made sure he didn't get sick, but only because a sick child couldn't earn money. In exchange, they demanded complete obedience and took everything passers-by gave to Pedro. The boy lived in a small, windowless room, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor. He had a few clothes, one pair of shoes, and his violin. Nothing else was truly his. Every day, he woke up early, ate a piece of bread with margarine, and went to work. Carlos drove him around the city, to shopping malls, upscale restaurants, tourist spots. Anywhere people had money. Pedro was growing, but his memory did not return. Sometimes, he had vivid dreams, a blue house with a terrace, an elderly woman with kind eyes, the sound of a violin in the morning air. But when he woke up, those images faded like mist, leaving behind only a vague sense of longing. "Pedro," Carlos would tell him, "forget those stupid dreams. Your life is here, with us. You've never had any other life." For years past, Pedro had become an experienced street musician. He knew the best places to play at different times of day, which melodies touched different hearts, how to look pitiful enough to evoke sympathy, but not so pitiful as to scare off potential listeners. His technique had reached an astonishing level. Years of constant practice, even under harsh conditions, had made his fingers quick and precise, and his musical instinct razor-sharp. People didn't stop just out of pity, they were mesmerized by his playing. During those years, Pedro became Carlos and Luisa's primary source of income. They moved into a better apartment, Luisa quit cleaning, and Carlos gave up petty theft. The boy brought in enough money for them to live comfortably. But as Pedro grew older, something began to awaken in him, questions about his past, and a sense that his life was meant to be different. His amnesia wasn't complete, sometimes fragments of memory pierced the fog of forgetfulness. He remembered the smell of fried tortillas, the sound of a woman's laughter, the feeling of safety and love. The memories never formed a full picture, but they made his heart ache. "Carlos," he asked one day, on his 12th birthday, "you never really told me where you found me. Maybe I had a family?" Carlos frowned. He disliked those kinds of questions, and they had been coming more often. "You were astray, Pedro. Completely alone. You had no one. We're your family now. But how do I know how to play like this? Someone must have taught me. It's natural talent. Sometimes that happens. But Pedro could feel something wasn't right. His musical knowledge was too advanced for a child who had grown up on the streets. He could play complex classical pieces that no one had taught him, and yet somehow, he knew them. Where did that knowledge come from, if not a formal musical education? Sometimes, while playing on the street, he noticed people watching him with a strange expression. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper. Surprise. Even shock. As if they were witnessing something impossible. One of those people was an old musician named Enrique Valencia. He often walked past the central cathedral, where Pedro played, and each time he stopped to listen. In his eyes was an expression Pedro couldn't understand, a mix of awe, sadness, and something like recognition. "Boy," Enrique said one day, approaching after Pedro had just finished playing Bach, "who taught you to play like that?" "No one," Pedro replied. "I just know this melody." "That's incredible," the old man shook his head. "You play like a professional musician. Like someone who studied for years at a conservatory." Pedro shrugged. He couldn't explain, he didn't understand it himself. Enrique kept coming back, and a strange kind of friendship developed between the two. The old musician was the only person who didn't see Pedro as a means of income, but as a true artist. "You have a rare gift, boy," Enrique would say. "A talent like yours appears once in a generation. You should be developing it, studying music seriously, not wasting your time on the streets." "Carlos says education is useless," Pedro would reply. "What matters is making money." Enrique shook his head. "That man has no idea what he's doing to you. You could be playing in concert halls, not on street corners. You could be a great musician, the whole world could know your name." These words stirred a strange echo in Pedro's heart. Concert halls, why did that phrase seem familiar? Why did something flutter in his chest every time Enrique mentioned it? But whenever he tried to dig deeper into those feelings, a sharp pain would bloom in his head, and the fragments of memory would slip away again. When Pedro turned 13, Carlos decided it was time to expand the business. He had heard from other street entrepreneurs that smaller towns in the region regularly hosted festivals and tourist events, where street performers could earn even more than in the big city. "Listen, Pedro," he said, unfolding a map of the region across the table, "we're going to hit all the key towns nearby. You'll play in new places, for new crowds. Tourists are always more generous than locals." Carlos mapped out a route that would take several weeks. It included towns known for their festivals, fairs, and attractions. The first on the list was the town of Santa Rosa, the very place where Mateo Hernandez had once lived. "There's a plaza near the old church and a few upscale restaurants," Carlos explained, reviewing information he'd found online. "Exactly the kind of place we're looking for." They left early in the morning in an old minivan Carlos had rented for the trip. Pedro sat by the window, watching the landscapes roll by, unaware that he was heading straight into the path of his forgotten past. Santa Rosa welcomed them with quiet cobblestone streets, whitewashed houses, and bright facades. The town was small and cozy, filled with the kind of charm only old settlements possess. Pedro didn't recognize his hometown. 5 years was a long time in the life of a boy, and his childhood memories were locked behind the walls of amnesia. To him, it was just another provincial town with a church in the main square, rows of small homes, and a tourist area near the central sites. Carlos quickly found the perfect place for Pedro to perform, a wide pedestrian area just outside the most expensive restaurant in town. El Patio Dorado was known for its fine cuisine and steep prices, with a clientele made up of wealthy tourists and local elites. "This is where the money is," Carlos said, surveying the spot. "Play your best pieces. And remember, smile, be sweet. People like to think they're helping a talented child chase his dream." Pedro took out his violin and tuned it. For his opening, he chose Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Something inside him whispered that this was the right music for this place and time. He didn't know why, but he felt a deep, personal connection to the piece. The violin sound floated through the air, and the first passers-by began to stop. Pedro played with his eyes closed, fully immersed in the music, just as he'd learned to do over years of street performing. What happened next was astonishing, even by the standards of a seasoned street performer. People didn't just drop coins and move on. They stopped, mesmerized, listening with open mouths. Some even began to cry. "My God," an elderly woman whispered to her companion. "This playing, it can't be real. It's impossible." "I know that style," said a middle-aged man who had also stopped. "But that can't be. That boy died 5 years ago." "It's him, I'm sure of it," insisted another woman. "No one else plays like that. Maybe he became an angel and came back down from heaven to play for us." Pedro didn't understand the crowd's reaction, but he kept playing. The music lived in his fingers, it felt native to him, though he couldn't explain why. Every note echoed in his heart, as if returning something long lost. The crowd grew larger. People called their friends, brought neighbors, and shared what they were seeing. Within 20 minutes, more than 50 people had gathered around Pedro, many of them in tears. Among the listeners was a boy his age. He looked as though he was waiting for someone. Diego stood near the window of a fancy restaurant, glancing toward the entrance of the nearby store where his grandmother was buying groceries. He was 9 years old and had come from the capital to spend summer break with Consuelo. The boy had hoped to spend his vacation playing games or hanging out with new friends, but his grandmother rarely asked him for anything, so he didn't refuse her request to go shopping together. The sound of the violin made him turn. On a small plaza in front of the restaurant stood a skinny teenager with a worn-out case at his feet, playing something heartbreakingly beautiful. Diego didn't know much about classical music, but he could tell this was something special. A crowd was beginning to gather around the musician. People stopped as if enchanted, some pulled out phones to record. Many were crying, and Diego didn't understand why. The melody was sad, yes, but not the kind to make people sob. "My God, this can't be real," whispered a woman nearby. Diego became alert. Who were they talking about? And why was everyone so emotional? Consuelo stepped out of the store with a bag of groceries, scanning the area for her grandson. But Diego was already running toward her. "Grandma, please, give a coin to that boy," he asked, pointing to Pedro playing the violin outside the upscale restaurant. The elderly woman looked at the face of the young beggar, and her hands began to tremble so violently that she dropped the grocery bags. "My God," she whispered. "It can't be." Consuelo stood frozen, pale as a sheet. Her eyes were wide, her lips moving silently, as if she was trying to say a name she didn't dare speak aloud. "Grandma, what's wrong?" Diego asked in alarm, tugging at her hand. "Are you okay?" But Consuelo didn't hear him. Slowly, she stepped through the crowd toward the musician, the people parting for her, seeing her shock. Each step was an effort, her heart pounded so hard she feared it would burst from her chest. The young violinist sensed someone approaching and opened his eyes. His gaze met the old woman's, and something flickered across his face, as if a distant memory stirred deep within him. Consuelo stopped just a few feet from Pedro, studying every line of his face. The same dark eyes with golden flecks, the same arch of the eyebrows, the same slender, musical fingers. Only the nose was slightly crooked, likely broken once and healed improperly. "What's your name?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Pedro," the boy answered, surprised. "And how old are you?" 13, he hesitated, unsure where the questions were leading. The world began to spin around Consuelo. 13, that was exactly how old Mateo would be now, if he had survived. "Where are you from?" she continued, trying not to show how badly her hands were shaking. I live with Carlos," Pedro said, pointing to the man standing nearby, watching the exchange with suspicion. "He found me when I was little." "Found you where?" "I don't remember. Carlos says I was a street kid." Consuelo's heart clenched. "Do you remember anything about your childhood? About your family?" The boy shook his head. "Sometimes I have dreams. A blue house with flowers, the smell of coffee in the morning, a woman's voice." But Carlos says they're just fantasies, he said sadly. Tears streamed down the old woman's cheeks. Everything matched: the age, the appearance, the musical talent, the memory loss. By some miracle, standing before her was the boy they had buried 5 years ago. Mateo, she whispered. Mateo Hernandez. At the sound of that name, something changed in the boy's eyes, like a string being plucked deep in his soul. Mateo, he repeated slowly, tasting the name. It sounds right. Carlos noticed the conversation was dragging on and started walking toward them. Years of living on the street had taught him to sense danger, and right now, every instinct told him something was going wrong. What do you want? He asked, eyeing Consuelo with suspicion. This boy, the old woman began, trying to keep her composure. Where did you find him? On the street, Carlos answered quickly, his usual lie at the ready. He was a stray. We took him in, raised him. Now he helps us earn a living. And who are you to be asking questions? Consuelo studied the man's face and saw the lie in his eyes, the cunning and guarded look of someone hiding something important. What year did you find him? She asked calmly, though her voice trembled slightly. Carlos scowled. Why do you care? I think I know this boy, Consuelo said softly. I don't believe his name is Pedro. Carlos's expression turned cold. You're mistaken, Senora. His name is Pedro, and he's been with us for years. Come on, Pedro. We're leaving. But Pedro didn't move. Something in the woman's words had touched a chord deep inside him. Her voice, her face, even the scent of her perfume stirred vague but insistent memories, and he desperately wanted to hold onto them. Carlos grabbed his arm sharply. Enough talking to strangers. We're going. Now. But Consuelo wasn't about to let the boy go. Wait, she cried, louder than she intended. If you're not hiding anything, why are you afraid of a conversation? Diego, who had been watching the scene unfold, now began to realize something serious was happening. Grandma, he said quietly, tugging at her sleeve, who is Mateo Hernandez? A boy who lived next door to me, Consuelo answered, not taking her eyes off Pedro Mateo. A boy who played the violin just like this one does. A boy who died in a car accident 5 years ago. Died? Pedro echoed, confusion in his voice. But I'm alive. Exactly, said Consuelo. And that's a miracle. The crowd began growing again. Many locals had heard the story of the Hernandez family and remembered little Mateo. What was happening before their eyes felt like a resurrection. It's really him, people whispered. Look how he holds the violin, just like Mateo did. And the eyes, added an old man. You never forget eyes like that. Carlos realized his secret was exposed, and the situation was slipping out of his control. He tried once more to grab Mateo and drag him away by force. But the crowd began to close in, surrounding them and blocking their way. Let the boy go, shouted Consuelo. That man kidnapped him, added someone from the crowd. Carlos panicked. He yanked Mateo toward him and tried to push through the people, but they wouldn't move aside. Then he pulled a knife from his pocket. Back off, or it'll get ugly, he threatened, waving the weapon. The crowd recoiled, and Carlos, still holding tightly to Mateo, began backing toward an alley. The boy struggled, but he was too weak. Police! Nobody move, a commanding voice rang out. Several uniformed officers rushed into the square. Someone from the crowd had managed to call them as soon as the confrontation began. Drop the weapon, shouted Officer Rodriguez, aiming his gun at Carlos. Carlos hesitated for a moment, and that was enough. Mateo broke free and ran to Consuelo, while the officers quickly surrounded the attacker. You don't understand. Carlos yelled as they wrestled him to the ground. I saved that kid. He'd be dead without me. But no one believed him. Too many people had witnessed him threatening the boy with a knife and trying to drag him away. The police arrived just 10 minutes after the incident began. By that time, nearly half the residents of the town center had gathered. The news that Mateo Hernandez, the boy believed to have died, was alive and standing in the square outside the restaurant had spread like wildfire. Senior Officer Rodriguez, leading the team, remembered the crash from 5 years ago. Back then, he had been a junior officer and had taken part in the search and rescue efforts. "Señora Consuelo," he said to the elderly woman, "can you explain what's happening here?" Consuelo, doing her best to speak clearly and convincingly, explained how she had recognized the street musician as Mateo Hernandez. She described the unique way he played, the way he held the violin, even the way he closed his eyes while performing, all traits that had been distinctly Mateo's. "Senor Rodriguez," she said, "I've known this child since the day he was born. I cannot be mistaken. This is Mateo." The officer turned to Mateo. "What do you say? Do you remember anything?" The boy stood in the middle of the chaos, clutching his violin tightly, feeling something stir deep within his mind. The name Mateo Hernandez echoed louder and louder in his soul, stirring fragments of memory. I don't know," he began uncertainly. "But when she says that name, something inside me responds." "Tell me what you do remember," Rodriguez asked gently. Mateo closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. "I remember rain. Heavy rain and screaming. I remember everything spinning, like the whole world turned upside down." Consuelo gasped. "The crash." He remembers the crash. "Anything else?" the officer asked. "A house," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling as emotion surged. He closed his eyes tighter, allowing the memories to flow freely. "A blue house with white shutters. A terrace with flower pots, geraniums, pink geraniums in the sun. And jasmine, at night it smelled so strong it made me dizzy." Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he kept going, afraid the visions would disappear if he stopped. "The smell of coffee from a copper pot in the mornings. Mom always made coffee at 6. The aroma would rise up to my window. And there was the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, and my mom's perfume." His breathing became unsteady. "My mother's voice, singing. She used to sing while making breakfast, while hanging laundry. Romantic songs and lullabies. And she would call me, she called, 'Mateo, my angel, wake up.' And when I heard it, I knew the day would be good, because it started with my mother's voice." Mateo opened his eyes and looked at Consuelo, his gaze filled with pain and wonder. "And there was laughter. My dad's laughter, when he came home from work. He always brought me something, a candy, a sticker, sometimes new sheet music. And he'd say, 'How's my little maestro doing?'" His voice broke. "And in the evenings I played in the yard, and all the neighbors came to listen. Under the big tree. And you always sat in the front row and smiled at me. And when I finished playing, you'd say, 'Bravo, my dear.' And I felt like the happiest child in the world." He whispered the last words while looking at Consuelo, and in that whisper was such longing for his lost childhood that everyone present felt their hearts tighten. Tears streamed down the old woman's cheeks. "Isabella, he remembers his mother," she whispered. "Mateo was taken to the hospital for medical evaluation." Consuelo never left his side, afraid that if she looked away, the boy might vanish again. The doctors confirmed that the boy had old injuries consistent with the aftermath of a serious accident. His left arm had once been broken and had healed improperly. Scars on his skull suggested head trauma, the likely cause of his amnesia. Psychiatrist Dr. Mendoza explained the situation to Consuelo. "Traumatic amnesia in children is not uncommon," he said. "The child's brain protects itself from unbearable pain by blocking the memories. But they don't disappear, they're simply locked away. And when the right triggers appear, familiar places, sounds, smells, faces, memory starts to return. The memories will come back gradually," the doctor continued. "Don't rush the process. Let it unfold naturally. What matters now is creating a safe and loving environment for the boy." Once all the formalities were settled and it became clear that Carlos would be held accountable for child abduction and forced begging, Consuelo brought Mateo home. They walked through familiar streets, and with every step, recognition flickered stronger in the boy's eyes. There was the bakery where Isabella used to buy bread. There was Maria's house, with her little corner shop. There was the turn leading to their street. When they reached Consuelo's house, Mateo stopped and stared at the blue house across the road. The house he once lived in. "That's our house," he whispered. "That's my room on the second floor." "Yes," Consuelo confirmed gently. "That's your home." They entered Consuelo's house, and the boy looked around slowly. Everything was familiar, yet strange, like a place from a long-forgotten dream. "Your violin," Consuelo said softly, pointing to the instrument in the corner of the living room. Mateo walked over and carefully picked it up. It was dusty, but the moment he placed it under his chin, everything felt right again. It was his violin, his faithful companion from childhood. The instrument he had learned to play on, where he had performed his first melodies. He drew the bow across the strings, and the air filled with a sound Consuelo hadn't heard in 5 years. At first, just a few notes. Then, a melody. And finally, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the piece he had been studying in the final week of his previous life. "Now I remember," Mateo said, lowering the violin. "I remember everything. The house, my mom, my dad, you. I remember how we were planning my audition for the conservatory. I remember that trip." His voice broke again. The return of his memories came with the realization that his parents were gone. Consuelo hugged the boy, and for the first time in 5 years, Mateo cried. He cried for his parents, for his lost childhood, for the years spent in captivity. But along with the tears came a sense of relief. He finally knew who he was. And now, he was the master of his own life. The following weeks were filled with discoveries and painful memories. Mateo lived with Consuelo and slowly adapted to his new life. His memory had fully returned, but the years he spent on the street had changed him. He had become more cautious, less trusting, but his love for music had only grown stronger. The news of Mateo Hernandez's miraculous return spread far beyond their little town. Journalists came to interview him, and various charities offered support. But Mateo struggled to communicate with strangers. Years with Carlos had taught him not to trust adults. Diego, Consuelo's grandson, became a bridge to the normal world for Mateo. The boys quickly became friends despite their age difference. Diego was fascinated by his new friend's story, especially his musical talent. But at the same time, Diego didn't see Mateo as a tragic figure or a victim of fate. To the 9-year-old, he was simply an older friend who could do amazing things. "Want me to show you how to play soccer?" Diego had asked on their very first day together, and for Mateo, it was a revelation. He hadn't played ordinary children's games in 5 years. Diego patiently explained the rules, taught him how to kick the ball, and never laughed when Mateo stumbled or fell. "Don't worry, I wasn't good at it at first either," Diego encouraged, and in his simple words was more healing than any therapy. Diego introduced Mateo to the modern world, video games, the internet, and mobile phones. To a boy raised on the streets, it all felt unbelievable. "Look, here you can find the sheet music for anything," Diego explained with excitement, and Mateo spent hours exploring music websites, discovering composers he had never heard of. Through Diego, Mateo met other kids in the neighborhood. The younger boy simply brought his friends over and introduced Mateo as "my new brother," and didn't let anyone ask hurtful questions. "He plays the violin really well, want to hear," he'd say, and the children's curiosity quickly shifted to the music. Diego taught Mateo to enjoy simple things: chocolate ice cream, weekend movies, bike rides through town. "Let's go to the river tomorrow," he'd suggest, and for Mateo, who hadn't allowed himself to make plans in years, it was like learning to dream again. Diego helped Mateo become a child once more. When they played in the yard, the older boy would forget his trauma, laugh, run, misbehave. Consuelo watched from the window as her grandson gave Mateo back his stolen childhood, and she realized this miracle was no smaller than his return from the dead. "Teach me to play," Diego asked one day. Mateo picked up his old violin and showed Diego the basics. These were his first lessons as a teacher, and to his surprise, he discovered he loved sharing what he knew. A month later, Consuelo's daughter, Carolina, arrived with her husband, Federico. The reunion was emotional. Carolina remembered Mateo as a joyful 8-year-old and struggled to recognize him in the serious young teenager standing before her. "We want him to live with us in the capital," she told her mother. "There are more opportunities for his musical education there." But Mateo refused firmly. "My home is here," he said, "with Abuelita Consuelo. I'll study music right here." Sadly, old Rafael had already passed away. But a new teacher was found in town, a young violinist named Andres Morales, a graduate of the capital's conservatory who had moved to Santa Rosa after marrying a local woman. When he heard Mateo play, he was stunned. "This boy has phenomenal talent," he told Consuelo. "His technique is astonishing. But most importantly, he has a soul. A true musical soul." Lessons with Andreas became a source of joy for Mateo. The teacher didn't just provide technical guidance, he helped heal emotional wounds through music. Together, they revisited pieces Mateo once knew, rebuilt lost knowledge, and explored new horizons. "Music heals," Andreas often said. "Your story proves it. You went through hell, but music never left you. It brought you home." Gradually, Mateo began performing, first in the local church, then at town festivals. At first, people came to see the boy who had returned from the dead. But in the end, they stayed for the music, beautiful, profound, filled with sorrow and hope. A few years later, a special concert was held in Santa Rosa. The town theater was full, musicians from the capital had come, along with journalists and music lovers alike. A grown Mateo stepped onto the stage in a black suit, holding the same violin Consuelo had kept safe for 5 years. The old woman sat in the front row, openly wiping away tears of joy. He began with Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the same fateful piece. The music flowed like a pure river, telling a story without words. A story of loss and rediscovery, of pain and healing, of the power of love and memory. The hall was completely silent, broken only by quiet sobs. People wept openly, without shame. Even professional critics couldn't hold back their emotions, hearing a young man who had turned his tragedy into art. When the final note faded, the theater erupted in applause. Mateo bowed and looked to the front row, where Consuelo dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "Thank you, Abuelita," he whispered. "I wouldn't be who I am without you." After the concert, a representative from the Vienna Conservatory approached him. "We're offering you a full scholarship," he said. "Your talent deserves the finest education in the world." Mateo looked at Consuelo. "What do you think?" "I'll tell you what I've always thought and said," the old woman smiled. "You will become a great musician, and the whole world will hear your music. And I will always be waiting for you at home." Mateo nodded silently. But after the guests had left and the theater stood empty, he sat beside Consuelo on a bench near the entrance. The stars above Santa Rosa shone as brightly as they had in his childhood, and the air still carried the scent of jasmine. "Abuelita," he asked quietly, gripping his violin case, "what if I'm not ready to leave home again? I already lost a family once. What if I lose you too?" Consuelo took his face in her wrinkled hands. "My dear boy, home isn't a place on a map. Home is the love we carry in our hearts. Your parents are with you every time you play. I'm with you whenever you remember our mornings on the terrace. And Diego, he'll always be with you, because friendship knows no distance." Her grandson, who had been patiently waiting his turn, ran up and hugged Mateo. "You'll come back, right? Promise?" "I'll come back for sure," Mateo promised, and that promise sounded like a sacred vow. The next month passed in a flurry of preparation. Andres Morales helped design an audition program, selecting pieces that best showcased Mateo's unique talent. "Don't play for the judges," the teacher advised. "Play for those you love. Let every note carry the memory of home." Consuelo prepared for the farewell in her own way. She knitted Mateo a warm sweater, packed jars of homemade mango jam, and gathered family photos. "It's cold in Vienna," she explained, tucking a third scarf into the suitcase. "And the food there's nothing like ours." Diego made a video on the computer, a film about Mateo's hometown, with shots of familiar streets, voices of neighbors, and the sounds of Santa Rosa waking up. "So you can show your new friends where you come from," the boy said seriously. A week before departure, the entire neighborhood gathered for a farewell concert. Mateo played beneath the same avocado tree where, as an 8-year-old, he had once given backyard performances. But now he was an artist, someone who could move adults to tears and silence children with awe. He performed the Four Seasons once more, the piece that had led him home. Then, he played a composition of his own, written especially for that evening, A Letter Home. The melody was filled with gratitude, love, and a promise to return. When the final notes faded into the warm evening air, the neighbors who remembered Mateo as a little boy came up and hugged him tightly. "Wherever you play," they said through tears, "remember that here, you will always be awaited." The next morning, half the neighborhood gathered at the bus station. Consuelo, as always up with the sunrise, had prepared a thermos of coffee for the road. "Coffee like in your childhood," she said, and Mateo wiped a tear from his eye. "Promise to write every week," Consuelo whispered, holding him close. "Promise not to forget where you're from," Diego added, handing him a small charm, a tiny violin carved from an avocado branch. "Promise to always remember that music is the language of the heart," Andreas said, shaking the hand of his best student. As the bus pulled away, Mateo pressed his face to the window and waved until the familiar faces became dots and his hometown dissolved into the morning mist over the mountains. The trial lasted 3 months. Carlos was charged with child abduction and forcing a minor to beg. His lawyer emphasized that the man had saved the boy from certain death and had provided him food and shelter for 5 years. "My client never beat the child, never sold drugs, never forced him into more serious crimes," the defense argued. Taking all factors into account, the judge sentenced Carlos to 2 years of community service. Luisa avoided criminal charges after testifying against Carlos and convincing the court she had acted under his pressure. "I knew it was wrong," she confessed in court, "but I was afraid of him. At least the boy wasn't starving with us, and I could see that music made him happy." She received only an administrative penalty for failing to report the crime. 2 years later, Carlos returned to his hometown and got a job as a porter at the local market. The work was hard but honest. At first, he was bitter at the world, convinced he was a victim. "I saved that kid," he told neighbors. "He'd be dead without me." But gradually, especially after a TV report about Mateo's success at the conservatory, something shifted in him. Luisa found work as a janitor in a local school. Working among children, she often thought about Mateo, the frightened little boy they had once taken in. Watching children laugh and play, she realized what had been stolen from him. "I'm glad he found his way home," she'd whisper, watching students in the hallway. She never tried to contact Mateo or his new family, believing the best thing she could do was to let them be. 3 years after the trial, Carlos unexpectedly sent a letter to Consuelo. In short, awkward sentences, he asked for forgiveness and inquired about Mateo. "I'm not asking for understanding," he wrote, "but I want you to know, I'm glad the boy made it home. He deserves a better life." At the Vienna Conservatory, Mateo became one of the top students. Professors were astonished by the maturity in his playing. "There is experience in your music that someone your age shouldn't have." "Pain matures you faster than time," Mateo replied. "But love gives you the strength not to break." After graduation, prestigious orchestras across Europe competed to offer him contracts. Critics wrote of his unique ability to turn technique into emotion, and audiences wept at the beauty of his performances. Mateo became a soloist with the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, and his concerts sold out worldwide. But for him, the most important thing was giving people hope through music. At concerts in London and Paris, in Tokyo and New York, audiences held their breath, listening to melodies born of pain and healed by love. His music spoke a language every heart understood, regardless of nationality or culture. Every year, he spent a month at home, performing in Santa Rosa and teaching local children. Whether playing under the avocado tree for his neighbors or on the stage of the Vienna Opera before thousands, he carried one message. Music is a bridge between hearts, and it is equally beautiful wherever there is love. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and comment.